So maybe you filled up a glass bottle full of acid. Maybe you want to throw it at some mounts. Maybe you're looking for some money. Well, here are the builds that I would recommend for you to do all of that and more. And, well, what could really make you some silver, or what could really throw that away? That really just comes down to your skill level and the builds that I'm providing. So good luck, and hopefully this helps. Whispering Bow, being a very damage heavy but also very glass cannon build for ganking, this is the setup that I would recommend. And with the variations for it, it comes with many, as for Thetford Cape or Demon Helmet, Hunter Jacket, Undead Cape, or Scholar Sandals, but honestly, any shoes with run ability at that point if you're not going to use Royal. Whispering Bow is going to have to be number 5. It has a lot of damage, its mobility isn't that great, and you can't really take that much damage either, which is why it's at number 5. As long as you have a group with good communication and possibly people that you can kite around so they CC them for you, you just get to auto attack the entire time and you're really all the damage you guys need. I wouldn't really recommend using this build in solo ganking, as for when you dismount someone, they're usually going to be a decent distance away from you, and if they are, they just use run ability and can walk away, so it makes it a little bit too difficult. Otherwise, if you have a group, I would definitely recommend at least one of you guys use this because it's a lot of fun, and as long as they're on your screen, you're killing them. This is probably the easiest build out of all of them to use. All you have to do is essentially use all of your abilities and auto attack. This has no problem dismounting horses or swift claws or even transport mounts. It does a lot of damage to it. Now, keep in mind, this build, like I was saying, you will be very squishy with it. Don't overextend too much, and if you do, make sure you have others by your side. You might be wondering why I'm using a healing potion instead of a poison potion, and that's simply because they won't really be next to you for you to use it, but at the same time, you don't really need it. 3 arrows, maybe 4 auto attacks should always dismount a mount, and the healing potion or an invisibility potion is simply for your safety because most people will turn on you, or if you guys mess up and gank someone that's a high priority target, you need some kind of escape, and all you really have is your Q, your assassin jacket, and maybe a healing potion. Claws, being one of the most notorious ganking weapons in Albion. This game in the early stages used to be used to gank portals, and it was very strong, and it still is one of the best, if not the best weapon to dismount mounts by yourself. Its damage is almost unbeatable when it comes to a solo weapon. This is one variation of the build that comes out very strong, but as well as everything else, there are variations as for Cal of Purity, Bridgewatch Cape, Graveguard Armor, Fiend Robe, or Mercenary Shoes. Claws come in at my number 4 spot. It would be number 3 if Frost wasn't in this list, but since it is, I think it's still a really good addition. This build can be used in multiple ways, as recommended. I don't really use Fiend Robe, but in case you're having too much trouble with hideouts, Fiend Robe is a really good addition, and it combos very fast and very well just after you use your E ability. This class isn't too difficult to use. One of the main skills you do rely on is Shadow Edge, which does take a couple levels to get to. A healthy alternative would be just normal dash, or maybe even the shuriken. Claws can easily be used for solo ganking, as well as it could be for group ganking. Its damage scales really well, and its CC very good. You can easily dismount somebody and also continue to do damage to them afterward, and you can follow up with them as long as you purge their mobility. This build consists of using communication to get your assassin jacket off early and dismount them without them even knowing that you're there, to use your hunter shoes to make your CC duration last longer, and most importantly, to make sure that you land your E ability. This weapon is very powerful against any mount in the game, and if you stack up enough of them, you can dismount some of the toughest transport mounts that people recommend to you to use. Now, Frost Staff is one of the strongest builds, for ganking in Albion. Unfortunately, with the new patch that's coming in soon, it may no longer be one of the top 3, or maybe even a ganking build anymore. But for the sake of memories, Froststaff still has a good spot in all of our hearts of it being one of the best ganking weapons in the game. This is the build I would recommend for it, and there's many, many variations of this build as for why it's so good. A couple variations you could go with is Cowl of Purity, Cleric Sandals for double blink, Bridge Watch Cape for the slow, Tome of Spells for increased cast speed, or even Scholar Robe for increased cast speed. This build varies from hard CC to pumping a bunch of damage, and that just depends on what items you decide to go with it. Froststaff is going to come in at my number 3 spot. This weapon has to be, and is, one of the strongest ganking weapons in the game. Goes kind of without saying if every group that's ganking always has a Froststaff with them. It's rather easy to use. Essentially, you'll either run up to them or you will double blink into an E or W, chain CCing them for roughly 2 to 3 seconds depending on the armor that you're using. This weapon is really good for ganking because not only does it apply a lot of crowd control, but it is very evasive. And the important thing to note is that this build does a lot of damage. Especially if you're in plate, don't be afraid to keep spamming the Q, as not only does it slow, but it also does a lot of damage. Depending on the build that you're using again, you can also change the Q, but for the most part, most builds will use the first one. This build's rather easy to use, you shouldn't have too much of a problem, and be mindful that as long as the mount has been tagged and you are slightly in front or next to them, you will almost always catch them, whether if it's a horse, a swift claw, or an adventure challenge mount. Paws, being one of the strongest builds currently in the game, and also one of the strongest in almost every content in the game. This is the variation that I've thought up and that I've used quite frequently in almost all of my ganking sessions, and every time I have had little to no worries dismounting anything from a boar all the way to sometimes even an ox by myself. This build is very strong, but with these items that I'm showing you currently, you are also very weak. This is a very glass cannon-y build and I find it to work very well, but as always there are variations. If you don't want to be as squishy as that, you can always opt in with Stalker, Assassin Jacket, or even Hunter Shoes, which would make you more tanky, or you can go in with the Bridge Watch Cape if you find that you're not fast enough. Paws have to be in my number 2, maybe 3 spot because of Frost there, but since Frost is getting nerfed, it's one of my favorite. It's not only one of the strongest damage weapons right now, but it's also very mobile with its run ability, its W, and its leap. This class is mainly used for dismounting or for damage purposes, but with the builds that I'm giving, it really allows you to just tackle almost any mount, including transport mounts, because of the true damage and the low cooldowns, but also it's really easy. This class, you just pop your run and your increased MS boost, and you just E at them. You hit them, and honestly, if you hit the mount, you just dismount them. It's pretty much all that it takes. Like I said before, this build's very squishy, but your damage output is rather good, so you have to keep mindful not to overextend too much, because if they are smart and turn on you, you are an easy target to kill. This class is mainly used in group ganking sessions. In solo, it can still be done. You just might have to tweak a couple things and be kind of smart about the abilities that you use. But for the most part, some gathers or some escape builds are definitely hard to catch, and Paws doesn't really have the mobility to outmaneuver most of them. If you're using the wrong items, you're always going to want some kind of purge, especially if you're solo ganking. The nerfs that are happening to axes won't really interfere with this build all too much. I don't think that it's going to really change the way that the outcome is, as long as you're just more smart about how you use your abilities. The only problem with axes at the moment is that if you pop your run and your W, you can pretty much stay next to a swift claw with gallop speed. So rightfully it's getting nerfed, but otherwise this has to be one of the funnest builds that I've used, and I hope that you enjoy using it as well. And a guide video would be nothing without a couple honorable mentions. So here are 3 honorable mentions that didn't quite make the list, just simply because either 1, I don't find them to be quite as good as the ones that are in the top 5, or they're already in the same weapon tree. Yet another weapon in the dagger tree, coming with DeathGivers being a very burst heavy weapon and one of the strongest in not only ganking. This build is definitely oriented around blowing up your targets with this build. As everything, there are variations of if you need a purge or if you just want that extra damage. DeathGivers have to make my list just because they are way too much fun. The damage of them is very good, and you should have no problem escaping as long as you're not overextending and you guys have good communication. This weapon is rather easy to use as well, especially if you have good communication. All you have to do is use your stacks, go invis, and then boots to the mount that you're trying to kill. The damage output of this scales very well with spec on top of the items you're using, especially with poisons, and you should have no problem dismounting any mount, unless if it's like a battle mount, of course, and you might want to be a little careful, you know. This build can be easily used to 1v1, or rather to solo gank. You just might need to swap out the stalker for a purge, and you can easily do it. If your group's missing some very much needed damage, DeathGivers would be a perfect addition to your comp. DeathGivers have no CC, unfortunately, so sometimes you'll find yourself relying on allies. Curse Staff is a very fun tree to play around with, and it'll be a good one to play with in ganking. This weapon and this build is very powerful for dismounting almost every mount that's not like a transport mount. I've had very good success with this, and especially in party. I'm still working my way with solo, but I'm sure with more practice I could get it done better. There's multiple variations of this coming in with a purge, stalker hood, graveguard chest piece, and if you want more damage you go Moisac, or you can go Bridgewatch Cape for the slow. Again, all serve different purposes, and each is to your own satisfaction. It's also another damage class that has 1 root ability, so you're not really like the CC of the group, but you're primarily the damage, and depending on the builds you use, you can do some pretty good damage. In these clips I have 0 spec, so my damage isn't that great, but you can see even just the dot ticking is more than enough for killing people that you are looking at. This build's really easy. All you have to do is essentially just get them up to 4 stacks, your W applying 1 of them, and then you press E and they just explode. As long as you're able to do that in a group or solo ganking, as this works in both, just be sure to stay next to them, as you don't want them to get too far away from you. I find this build kind of difficult to use in solo ganking, but if you do use it, I'd probably recommend using soldier boots, and the Cowl of Purity is simply because they will never really be next to you for you to purge them. If they are, that's good, but most of the time you'll run into people using Scholar Sandals, which Cowl of Purity can interrupt. GrailSeeker has to make the list at probably one of the most fun builds because it was created for corrupted dungeons. This is the notorious corrupted dungeon build that a lot of people have probably died to, and well, you'll probably die to it ganking as well. There are variations from this, going with Demon Helmet, Graveguard Chest Piece, Assassin Jacket, Stalker Hood, or Mage Cowl, each serving completely different purposes to whatever you're looking for. GrailSeeker is also one of the funnest ganking weapons that I've used. The only downfall that I find is it does lack some well-needed mobility, so sometimes you are left behind to die, but it's really good in locking down certain areas or locking down a mount if you have them dismounted. This weapon's super fun because depending on the build you use, you can easily kill someone by yourself for solo ganking or even in group ganking, but also you can lock down areas where they're running to make it to where they are forced to walk into you, let's say a hideout, or maybe if they're trying to zone to a different instance. GrailSeeker's rather easy. You just use your shoes, or maybe you start with your assassin, W, and then you just E somebody. And the nice part about this is the game gives you a second E ability, so in case you missed the first one, you have a second one to redeem yourself, and sometimes redeeming yourself feels really good with this build. One of the builds that I used quite frequently in the past before constantly using double-bladed staff was Bloodletter. And essentially I would use the exact same build as double-bladed, except I'd use it on Bloodletter. I had more fun with it, and I was always kill stealing, which was a lot of fun. This is the build I would recommend for you to use. It's a little weird using undead cape, so if you don't feel too confident with that, you can go bridge watch. It's simply because it's the only escape that you really have, except for maybe your run and like your W, Q, and E. Besides that, you have no escape. There are some alternatives with this, going between Stalker Hood, Assassin Jacket, Mage Cowl, Moisac, Bridge Watch, Cape, Cleric Robe, and Crypt Candle. All these serve different purposes, from being the damage, to being the catch, to being the one-shot build person. This build's very strong in groups, although in solos it could be possible, but it might be a little bit more difficult. To keep the last one short, Bloodletter is a really good addition to every comp because you'll always need someone as a finisher. Regardless of what people will say, if you're kill stealing or whatever they want to call it, you being able to kill someone 5 seconds quicker than not having a Bloodletter is really important, especially if you're time gated on how fast you need to kill somebody. Bloodletter has really good mobility so that you can always stay on top of their targets, and besides that, you can always follow up on the targets very easily. It's a really good and very easy build to use. Double-bladed staff right now in Albion is one of the strongest, if not top 3 best ganking builds in the game. This build is so strong that it is primarily used for solo ganking or group ganking, and you will always see at least one in every party. There's multiple variations of this build. You can come in with Graveguard, chest piece, Stalker Hood if your group's already running too many of something else, or Mage Cowl, which a lot of people preferred in the older version. But right now, the Fiend Cowl is probably going to be your best bet with how the meta is going in the game at the moment. Double-bladed staff is taking my #1 spot as the best ganking weapon in Albion, and it has been for a very long time. This weapon is notorious for being used in solo ganking, group, or even corrupteds now at this point, now that quarterstaff got nerfed as hard as it did. Double-bladed staff should have no trouble dismounting any armored horses, swift claws, giant horses, or even other adventure challenge mounts. It can't solo dismount a transport mount, but on the other hand, it has a very easy time staying next to them and CCing them for the rest of your party to get to them. This build is rather easy to use. Simply, all you need to do is either go invis before the target gets to you, or you can just stand dismounted in certain areas where you know there's high traffic. Use your shoes and stun run immediately and run at them. If you don't feel like you're going to get your auto attack off, then either throw a poison or use your E ability to close that gap, and then follow up with the auto attack. The auto attack is going to proc your demon cape, allowing you to do even more damage, and at that point you'll start stacking Q stacks so you can stun them shortly after. Being on top of someone gives you a really easy time being able to purge them, which is the main source of most escape builds. After purging them, they're usually rendered useless, and you have very high mobility with this, so you should kill them rather easy. If you find yourself always being fought against, just know sometimes it's better to stay there and keep fighting rather than running away, because you are very strong with double-bladed staff compared to most builds in the game. Or if you come next to an instance that needs you to zone through but you're in combat, you can use your Assassin Jacket to make them seem like you went through when you actually didn't, thus taking you out of combat, or at least getting it closer to the timer of taking you out of combat for you to escape. Double-bladed staves can be used with more than one in the same party, allowing you to split up the groups to rely on the double-bladed staff to get the catch while the damage does the rest of the work. Double-bladed staves is most of the work by dismounting them and CCing them, and also purging, so it's a heavy role to take on if you're new. I'd recommend starting with damage, getting more comfortable, and then going into double-bladed staff, because like I said, if you're missing a bunch of skills and you can't dismount people with a double-bladed, then your group's going to kind of look at you. Double-bladed staff has many alternatives you can use. Some of the most common ones are Graveguard armor with Stalker Hood, or sometimes people use like Calipurity or Mage Cal for the extra damage. It really just depends on the situation and who you're ganking. This weapon's so strong that you can easily solo many builds simply because of how much CC it has. One of the big things about this build is that as long as you are going in and you're playing very confident, your auto attacks are stunning every 4th auto attack, and your W's coming up every 15 seconds, your E's coming up, and you have an F very quickly as well. You should have no problem dismounting anyone, and you should have no problem at least 1v1ing for a bit until your allies get to you. This staff is a lot of fun, and it's been the best in Albion for a very long time, whether you are the person to dismount or whether someone else is. A good thing to note is if gatherers are using your ganking weapon to escape gankers, then it must be pretty good. When ganking and using Assassin Jacket, you need to get familiar with the Invisibility Bait. As you can see, many people use it, as I use it on Zergs or on other groups. Essentially, it just takes the focus away from you if they're focusing somebody else, or if you come next to an instance that needs you to zone through but you're in combat, you can use your Assassin Jacket to make them seem like you went through when you actually didn't. I hope this guide helped those of you who needed the information about it, and I wish you the best of luck on killing people. But just so we're clear, I get a free pass one time if I helped you, okay? Otherwise, thank you guys for watching the video. If you watched all the way through, you can find my Twitch and my Discord in the description of the video. Otherwise, have a good morning, a good evening, or a good night.